January 1945. Deep in the heart of Versailles, in an office that once belonged to Napoleon himself, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower stands alone in front of a fireplace. The room is dark, except for the flickering flames. In his hands, he holds a stack of documents, official notes from a meeting that ended just 30 minutes ago. His chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, watches from the doorway as Eisenhower feeds the papers into the fire, one by one. "Sir," Smith says quietly, "are you absolutely sure about this?" Eisenhower does not turn around. He watches the papers curl and blacken in the flames. "Some conversations, Bedell," he says, "should never be recorded. Some things are too dangerous to exist on paper." Smith nods slowly. He understands. What just happened in this room was so explosive, so potentially devastating to the Allied cause, that any written record could destroy the fragile alliance holding together the war against Nazi Germany. The words spoken here tonight could never be allowed to surface. Not now, maybe not ever. But here is what we know. Here is what survived, despite Eisenhower's attempt to erase it from history. 30 minutes earlier, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, one of Britain's most celebrated generals, sat across from Eisenhower in that same room. And what transpired between them was not a polite disagreement between allies. It was not a strategic debate between military professionals. It was a confrontation so brutal, so definitive, that it would end Montgomery's influence over American forces forever. It was the moment when the patient, diplomatic Supreme Commander finally stopped being patient and diplomatic. The moment when Eisenhower looked Montgomery in the eye and said, in words that cannot be misunderstood, "Shut up, fall in line, or get out." What could have driven Eisenhower, a man famous for his ability to manage egos and maintain coalition unity, to this breaking point? What words were exchanged in that room that had to be destroyed? And why, when Joseph Stalin heard about this meeting through his intelligence networks 12 hours later, did he smile? These are not rhetorical questions. These are mysteries that have haunted historians for decades, because the truth is, we are still piecing together what really happened that night in Versailles. And every piece we find makes the story more shocking than we imagined. Let me take you back to how this all started. Let me show you the power struggle that almost tore apart the Allied command, because this was not just about two men having an argument. This was about the future of the war, the fate of millions of lives, and a secret campaign that Montgomery had been waging for months to seize control of the entire Allied offensive. Montgomery arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters that night, expecting another strategic discussion, perhaps another opportunity to press his case, to argue for his vision of how the war should be won. He had done this dozens of times before. He had lobbied, complained, criticized, and undermined Eisenhower's decisions at every turn. And Eisenhower had tolerated it, had absorbed it, had remained calm and diplomatic because that was his job, to keep the alliance together no matter what. But not tonight. Tonight was different. When Montgomery walked into that office, he found Eisenhower standing, not sitting, arms crossed, expression harder than Montgomery had ever seen it. And before Montgomery could even begin his usual routine, Eisenhower spoke. "Your remarks to the press," Eisenhower said, his voice low and controlled, "have caused serious damage to Allied unity. American generals are furious. American newspapers are calling for your removal. And I am not sure I disagree with them." Montgomery tried to respond, tried to explain that he had been praising American troops, that the press had misunderstood his intentions. But Eisenhower raised his hand. "Silence. I do not care about your intentions." Eisenhower continued, "I care about results. And the result is that you have made every American officer question whether this is truly a partnership or whether we are just here to provide men and equipment for British glory." The temperature in the room dropped. Montgomery, accustomed to being treated with deference, with respect for his rank and his achievements, suddenly realized this was not a discussion. This was something else entirely. And then Eisenhower said the words that would change everything. "You seem to believe you should be running this campaign. You have made that abundantly clear in every conversation we have had since September. So let me make something equally clear to you right now. You are not running this campaign. I am. And if you cannot accept that fact, then I will personally ask Winston Churchill to relieve you of your command. If you want to understand how we got to this moment, how the greatest military alliance in history nearly collapsed over the egos of two men, then stay with me. Because this is just the beginning of a story that involves secret meetings with Churchill, a conspiracy that reached all the way to the Kremlin, and a document that both sides agreed must never see the light of day. I am going to take you through every twist, every revelation, every classified detail that has emerged over the past 80 years. But I need you to do something first. If you are fascinated by the untold confrontations that shaped our world, if you want to hear the stories that never made it into the history books, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications, because next week I am bringing you another explosive story that you will not find anywhere else. Trust me, you will not want to miss it. Now, back to that room in Versailles. Back to two men locked in a battle of wills that would determine not just who commanded Allied forces, but who would shape the entire post-war world. Because what happened next, what Eisenhower said, and what Montgomery was forced to accept, was just the surface. Beneath it lay a hidden war that had been raging for months. A war that Stalin was watching with great interest. A war that could have handed victory to the Soviet Union before a single Russian soldier crossed into Germany. And it all came down to this one meeting, this one night, these burned documents. So, what was really said in that room? What did those papers contain that Eisenhower could not allow to survive? And why does a rumor persist, even today, that somewhere in a classified archive, there exists an audio recording of this confrontation, sealed until the year 2045? Let me show you what we know. Let me show you what we can prove. And let me show you the mysteries that remain unsolved. This is the story of the night Eisenhower stopped being diplomatic. To understand why Eisenhower finally snapped that night, you need to know what Montgomery had been doing behind the scenes for months. This was not just about military strategy. This was about a carefully orchestrated campaign to take control of the entire Allied war effort. And the evidence, much of it declassified only in the past few decades, is damning. Start with this. Between December 1944 and January 1945, Montgomery met privately with Winston Churchill 3 times. Not casual meetings, not routine briefings. These were deliberate, strategic sessions where Montgomery laid out his case for why he, not Eisenhower, should be running the show. We know this because Churchill's private secretary kept notes that were sealed for 50 years and only released in 1995. In those meetings, Montgomery argued that American generals lacked the experience and tactical sophistication to lead a coordinated offensive into Germany. He claimed that Eisenhower's broad front strategy was wasteful, inefficient, and would cost thousands of unnecessary lives. He insisted that a single, concentrated thrust under British command, specifically his command, was the only way to end the war quickly. But here is where it gets interesting. Montgomery did not stop with Churchill. He went higher. Classified documents released in 2001 reveal that Montgomery wrote directly to King George VI. Think about that for a moment. A field commander, bypassing his own chain of command, appealing to the monarch to intervene in military strategy. That is not professional disagreement. That is insubordination dressed up as patriotic concern. And there is more. Montgomery also reached out through back channels to Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. Why? Because Canadian forces were under Montgomery's command, and he wanted political support from Ottawa to pressure the Americans. He was building a coalition, not to defeat Germany, but to sideline Eisenhower. Now, you might think this was just Montgomery being Montgomery. The man had an ego the size of the English Channel. Everyone knew that. But what makes this truly explosive is what was happening simultaneously on the American side. In early January 1945, General Omar Bradley sent a confidential memorandum to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. The message was simple and stark: Montgomery or me. Bradley, one of the most level-headed generals in the American Army, was threatening to resign rather than continue serving in a command structure that included Montgomery. This was not hyperbole. Bradley meant it, and he was not alone. George Patton, never one for subtlety, wrote in his personal diary, an entry that was not declassified until 1974, that he would rather serve under Adolf Hitler than take another order from that insufferable British prima donna. Patton also suggested, only half-jokingly, that someone should challenge Montgomery to a duel, but the most shocking revelation came in 2003, when researchers discovered a draft letter in the National Archives. A letter signed by 4 senior American generals, including Bradley and Patton, formally tendering their collective resignation. The letter was never sent. Why? Because Eisenhower personally intervened and promised them that he would handle Montgomery once and for all. That promise is what led to the meeting in Versailles. Now here is where the conspiracy deepens. During this exact same period, British intelligence was intercepting American military communications. This was standard practice among allies. Everyone spied on everyone, even friends. But what remains unclear is whether British intelligence shared these intercepts with Montgomery. Did he know about the American general's revolt before it happened? Did he have advance warning that Eisenhower was reaching a breaking point? We do not know for certain. But the timing of Montgomery's actions suggests he might have. Because just days before Eisenhower called him to Versailles, Montgomery gave that infamous press conference on January 7, 1945, the one where he essentially claimed credit for saving American forces during the Battle of the Bulge. And here is what most people do not realize about that press conference. It was not a mistake. It was not a case of Montgomery being tone-deaf or the press misunderstanding him. We have the draft of his prepared remarks, a draft that was discovered in British archives in 2006, and those remarks were carefully crafted to position himself as the savior of the American army while subtly undermining confidence in American commanders. Why would he do this? Why would Montgomery deliberately provoke the Americans at the exact moment when tensions were already at a breaking point? One theory is that Montgomery believed he had Churchill's full backing and that the political pressure would force Eisenhower to step aside. Another theory is that Montgomery genuinely believed his own press, that he was so convinced of his superiority that he could not see how his actions were perceived. But there is a third theory, one that is more disturbing and more plausible. Montgomery wanted a confrontation. He wanted Eisenhower to either submit to his demands or escalate the conflict to the political level, where Montgomery believed Churchill would support him over Roosevelt. It was a calculated gamble, a power play disguised as military professionalism. But Montgomery miscalculated, badly, because what he did not know, what he could not have known, was that Churchill had already decided Montgomery was a liability. A secret telegram, sent from Churchill to Roosevelt just 2 days before the Versailles meeting, said this: "Monty has become more trouble than he is worth. Handle it as you see fit. We will not interfere." That telegram, declassified in 1995, was Eisenhower's green light. Churchill had given the Americans permission to put Montgomery in his place, and Eisenhower was about to do exactly that. So, when Montgomery walked into that office in Versailles, he thought he was walking into a negotiation. He thought he still had leverage. He thought wrong. What he was actually walking into was an ambush. A professional execution carried out by a man who had finally run out of patience. And the most chilling part? Soviet intelligence knew about all of this. Joseph Stalin's spies inside Allied headquarters were feeding him real-time updates on the growing rift between British and American commanders, and Stalin was thrilled, because every day that Montgomery and Eisenhower spent fighting each other was another day that Soviet forces could advance deeper into Eastern Europe. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Was Montgomery simply a victim of his own ego? Or was he, however unwittingly, serving Soviet interests by fracturing Allied unity at the most critical moment of the war? Before we go further, I am curious. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing where this story is reaching people around the world. And if you are listening to this at some ungodly hour because you could not sleep, trust me, I have been there too. History insomnia is real. Eisenhower spent 3 days preparing for that meeting. 3 days. For a 30-minute conversation. That alone should tell you how seriously he took this. What we know about those 3 days comes from declassified phone transcripts and the personal notes of Harry Butcher, Eisenhower's naval aide. On January 12th, Eisenhower placed a secure call to General George Marshall back in Washington. The conversation lasted 47 minutes, and what Marshall told him changed everything. "You have my full authority," Marshall said, "to relieve any Allied commander who cannot follow orders. Any commander. I do not care what flag they serve under. If they cannot accept American leadership of this campaign, send them home." Think about what that means. The Army Chief of Staff was giving Eisenhower explicit permission to fire a British field marshal. That had never happened before in the history of the Anglo-American alliance. But Marshall went further. He told Eisenhower that a replacement had already been selected. General Harold Alexander, commander of Allied forces in Italy, was standing by. If Montgomery refused to fall in line, Alexander would be in Versailles within 48 hours to take over British forces. This was not a bluff. This was a loaded gun that Marshall had just handed to Eisenhower. But Eisenhower did something unexpected. He did not just prepare talking points or strategy notes. He rehearsed the confrontation with Bedell Smith playing the role of Montgomery. We know this because Smith mentioned it years later in an interview that was not published until 2012. According to Smith, Eisenhower ran through the conversation at least 6 times. Each time, Smith would throw out the arguments he knew Montgomery would make, the strategic objections, the appeals to Churchill, the veiled insults about American tactical incompetence. And each time, Eisenhower refined his responses, eliminating any room for negotiation or ambiguity. Smith remembered one particular moment during these rehearsals. Eisenhower stopped mid-sentence, looked at him, and said, "I cannot give him any wiggle room, not 1 inch. If I let him argue, if I let him think this is a debate, I have already lost." Now here is a detail that most histories miss. Eisenhower chose the location deliberately, not just Versailles, not just the palace, but specifically Napoleon's former office. Why does that matter? Because Napoleon was the last man who tried to conquer Europe through military genius alone, ignoring political reality, and he ended up in exile. The symbolism was intentional. Eisenhower was sending a message before Montgomery even walked through the door. There is another detail about that room that is worth noting. In 1998, a French historian doing research on the palace discovered something interesting in the maintenance records from January 1945. Audio recording equipment had been installed in that office just 3 days before the meeting. Equipment that belonged to the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA. Was the meeting recorded? Officially, no such recording exists. But the equipment was there, it was functional, and it was removed 2 days after the meeting. Make of that what you will. When Montgomery arrived, he was on time, punctual as always. But according to the guard who escorted him, Montgomery seemed relaxed, almost confident. He nodded to the American officers he passed in the hallway. He made a joke about the weather. This was a man who thought he was in control of the situation. He was not. Eisenhower was standing when Montgomery entered, not behind his desk, standing in the center of the room. Arms crossed, no handshake, no offer to sit, just silence. 10 seconds of silence that must have felt like an eternity. Then Eisenhower started talking, and what he said, based on Montgomery's own letter written that same night to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, was devastating. "I am going to speak," Eisenhower began, "and you are going to listen. You will not interrupt. You will not argue. You will not explain. When I am finished, you will give me a yes or a no. Those are your only 2 options." Montgomery, according to his letter, was stunned. No one had ever spoken to him this way. Not Churchill, not the king, no one. Eisenhower continued, "Your press conference was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to claim credit for American sacrifices while positioning yourself as superior to American commanders. Do not insult my intelligence by claiming otherwise." Montgomery started to speak. Eisenhower cut him off with a single raised hand. "I said you will not interrupt." What happened next is where the accounts get truly interesting, because we have 3 different descriptions of this moment. Eisenhower's briefing to Smith afterward, Montgomery's letter to Brooke, and a report filed by British liaison officer who was debriefed by Montgomery later that evening. And all 3 versions agree on one thing. Eisenhower's voice never rose. He never shouted, never lost his temper. But the intensity, the controlled fury, was more frightening than any outburst could have been. "You have spent months undermining my authority," Eisenhower said, "lobbying Churchill, writing to the king, spreading doubt among your own officers about American competence. You think I do not know about these things? You think I do not have sources? Bernard, I know everything you have done, everything you have said, and it ends tonight." Then came the ultimatum, the moment everything had been building toward. "You have 2 choices, only 2. First choice, you accept my command authority without reservation. You stop lobbying Churchill. You stop criticizing American generals. You clear all press statements through my headquarters. You treat Omar Bradley as an equal, not as a subordinate. You conduct yourself as part of this alliance, not as its self-appointed savior. Second choice, you refuse these terms, and I will call Winston Churchill within the hour and request your immediate relief. Those are your options. Choose now. Montgomery's response, according to his own letter, was to try one more time to explain his strategic reasoning, to argue that his concerns were legitimate, that a single thrust into Germany made more military sense than Eisenhower's broad front approach. And this is the moment when Eisenhower did something that became legendary among those who heard about it secondhand. He walked to his desk, put both hands on it, leaned forward, and the desk cracked, actually cracked under the pressure. You can still see the crack today if you visit that office. A thin split in the wood, running 6 inches along the front edge. I am not discussing strategy, Eisenhower said, his voice dropping even lower. I am discussing your future. Choose. The silence that followed lasted, according to Montgomery's letter, at least a full minute, maybe longer. Montgomery standing there, realizing that every card he thought he held was worthless, that Churchill was not coming to save him, that his reputation, his legacy, everything he had built, was about to be decided by what he said in the next 10 seconds. Finally, Montgomery spoke. I accept your terms. While Montgomery was being humiliated in Versailles, something remarkable was happening 1,500 miles away in Moscow. Joseph Stalin received a coded telegram from his intelligence network. The message was brief. Meeting concluded. Eisenhower victorious. Montgomery neutralized. Stalin read the message twice. Then, according to his interpreter Vladimir Pavlov, whose memoir was published in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union, Stalin actually smiled. Not his usual cold, calculated expression. A genuine smile. Perfect, Stalin said to Vyacheslav Molotov, his foreign minister. Let them fight each other. Every hour they waste on pride is another mile we gain. This is where the story takes a darker turn, because the question everyone should be asking is this. How did Soviet intelligence know about a private meeting between two Allied commanders almost immediately after it happened? A meeting so secret that Eisenhower destroyed the official records? A meeting that took place in a secure facility with no witnesses? The answer, declassified in KGB files released after the Soviet collapse, is chilling. The Soviets had a source inside Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, codename Gustav, and Gustav had access to everything. We still do not know who Gustav was. The files do not reveal the actual identity. But what we do know is that Gustav reported directly to the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and provided detailed intelligence on Allied command disputes from June 1944 through May 1945. The reports were so accurate, so detailed, that some historians believe Gustav must have been a senior staff officer, someone with direct access to Eisenhower's inner circle. And here is what makes this conspiracy truly disturbing. The Soviet reports show that Moscow knew about the Eisenhower-Montgomery confrontation 12 hours before it actually happened. 12 hours. Which means Gustav did not just report what happened. Gustav knew it was going to happen. Think about the implications. Either Gustav was present during Eisenhower's planning sessions with Bedell Smith, or someone who was present reported to Gustav. Either way, Soviet intelligence was inside the room where the most sensitive Allied decisions were being made. But why did Stalin care so much about this meeting? Why did a confrontation between Allied commanders matter to Soviet strategy? The answer lies in the race to Berlin. By January 1945, everyone knew the war was nearly over. Germany was collapsing. The only question was who would get to Berlin first, the Western Allies or the Soviet Union? And more importantly, who would control how much of post-war Europe? Stalin's strategy depended on one critical factor: delaying the Western advance long enough for Soviet forces to capture as much territory as possible. Every day that American and British forces were tied up west of the Rhine was another day that the Red Army could push deeper into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Eastern Germany. Montgomery's power struggle with Eisenhower was a gift to Stalin, a complete gift. Because while British and American generals were arguing about who should be in charge, Soviet forces were advancing at a rate of 15 to 20 miles per day. The numbers are staggering. Between January 1st and February 1st, 1945, during the exact period when the Montgomery-Eisenhower crisis was at its peak, Soviet forces advanced over 300 miles on the Eastern Front. Coincidence? Maybe. But Stalin did not believe in coincidences. Here is where it gets even stranger. Declassified Soviet military documents from this period show that Stalin accelerated his offensive timeline in mid-January. Originally, the major push toward Berlin was scheduled for late February, but on January 14th, just days after the Versailles meeting, Stalin ordered his commanders to advance the schedule by 6 weeks. Why? Some historians argue it was because of German weakness. Others say it was weather conditions. But there is a third theory, proposed by former KGB analyst Pavel Sudoplatov in his 1994 memoir. Stalin accelerated because Gustav's reports convinced him that Allied command was temporarily paralyzed by internal conflict. The window was open, and Stalin intended to drive through it. Now, here is the question that keeps conspiracy theorists awake at night. Was Montgomery aware that his actions were serving Soviet interests? Was he deliberately trying to fracture Allied unity to benefit the Soviets? The answer, based on everything we know, is almost certainly no. Montgomery was not a Soviet agent. He was not a traitor. He was simply a man whose ego and ambition made him a useful idiot for Soviet intelligence. And that, in some ways, is even more damning, because it means Montgomery's vanity was exploited by Stalin without Montgomery even realizing it. But there is another layer to this conspiracy, one that did not come to light until 2008. A British historian named Andrew Roberts was researching Churchill's wartime papers when he discovered something odd: a gap in Churchill's daily diary. 3 days in mid-January 1945, where there are no entries, no meetings, no phone calls, no notes, just blank pages. This was highly unusual. Churchill was meticulous about documenting his schedule. So, where was he during those 3 days? Roberts kept digging and eventually found a reference in the diary of Churchill's private secretary. Churchill had traveled to a secure location outside London for what the secretary described as urgent consultations regarding Soviet intentions. Who was Churchill meeting with? We do not know for certain, but intelligence reports from this same period show that British codebreakers had intercepted Soviet communications, suggesting that Moscow knew details about Allied planning that should have been impossible to know. Churchill, it seems, had figured out that there was a leak, and he was trying to determine how deep it went. Did Churchill warn Eisenhower? Did he tell the Americans that Soviet intelligence had penetrated Allied headquarters? Again, we do not know. But what we do know is that security protocols at Supreme Headquarters were dramatically tightened in late January. Access was restricted. Communications were re-encrypted, and several staff officers were quietly reassigned without explanation. Someone was cleaning house. Someone suspected there was a mole. Whether they ever found Gustav remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of World War II. But here is the most unsettling part of this entire conspiracy. If Montgomery had won his power struggle with Eisenhower, if Churchill had backed him and forced Roosevelt to replace Eisenhower with a more compliant commander, what would have happened? Military historians have run this scenario. A single thrust into Germany, under Montgomery's command, launched in February 1945, would have required concentrating almost all Allied forces in the north. It would have left the central and southern fronts thinly defended. And according to German intelligence assessments captured after the war, it would have created an opportunity for a German counteroffensive that could have delayed the Allied advance by months. Months that would have allowed Soviet forces to capture not just Berlin, but Prague, Vienna, Copenhagen, and possibly even parts of northern Germany that remained under Western control in our timeline. The entire map of the Cold War could have been redrawn, and Stalin knew it. Which is why, when Stalin heard that Eisenhower had crushed Montgomery's rebellion, he smiled. Not because he was happy, but because he recognized that his best opportunity to dominate post-war Europe had just slipped away. The morning after the confrontation, Allied headquarters issued a statement. Standard diplomatic language. Productive meeting between Supreme Commander Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery. Full agreement on strategic objectives. Continued close cooperation. All the usual meaningless phrases that governments use when they are desperately trying to hide a crisis. But behind the scenes, the machinery of damage control was working overtime. Within 6 hours of Montgomery leaving that office, something unprecedented happened. British liaison officers embedded with American divisions across the entire European theater received urgent orders. Return to British sectors immediately. No exceptions. No delays. Dozens of officers who had been working side by side with their American counterparts for months were suddenly pulled out. The official explanation was routine reassignment. The reality was that someone in London was afraid of what those officers might report about American attitudes toward Montgomery. This was not normal procedure. This was emergency protocol, the kind of thing you do when you think your alliance is about to fracture. At the same time, Churchill was sending a different kind of message, a personal telegram to Montgomery, not through official channels, not through the War Office, through his private courier network. The telegram was short, brutal, and it was not declassified until 2003, nearly 60 years after it was sent. It read, "You will comply with Eisenhower's directives in full and without reservation. You will make no further appeals to me or anyone else regarding command arrangements. You will issue a public statement of support for Allied unity within 24 hours. If you fail to do any of these things, I will relieve you myself and ensure that your career ends in disgrace. Do you understand?" Montgomery understood. That same evening, he drafted a letter to Eisenhower. The letter still exists in the National Archives. You can read it yourself if you visit. The handwriting is tight, controlled. You can almost feel the tension in how the pen pressed into the paper. The letter expresses complete confidence in Eisenhower's leadership. It pledges full cooperation. It apologizes for any misunderstandings created by recent public statements. But here is what makes that letter fascinating. Montgomery drafted it 7 times, 7 different versions before he finally sent one. How do we know? Because a researcher in 2009 found the discarded drafts in Montgomery's personal papers at the Imperial War Museum, and reading them in sequence is like watching a man slowly surrender his pride. The first draft is defiant, still arguing strategy, still claiming his press conference was justified. By the third draft, the defiance is gone, but the bitterness remains. Passive-aggressive language about doing his duty, despite disagreements. The fifth draft is almost there. Proper tone, proper deference, but still too much focus on Montgomery's own importance. The seventh draft, the one he finally sent, is perfect, completely submissive. Everything Eisenhower demanded. What broke him between drafts 1 and 7? We will never know for certain, but Montgomery's biographer suggests it was a phone call from Churchill that night. A phone call where the Prime Minister made absolutely clear that there would be no political rescue, no intervention with Roosevelt, no escape hatch. Montgomery was on his own, and if he wanted to finish the war with his reputation intact, he would do exactly what Eisenhower told him to do. The letter worked. Eisenhower accepted it. Publicly, the crisis was over, but privately, everything had changed. Montgomery never again had direct input into American operations. When Bradley planned the crossing of the Rhine in March, Montgomery was not consulted. When Patton made his famous dash across Germany in April, Montgomery learned about it from radio broadcasts like everyone else. When the final strategy for linking up with Soviet forces was decided, Montgomery received his orders the same way any subordinate commander would. Through official channels, no discussion, no debate. The demotion was subtle enough that most people did not notice. But everyone in the Allied command structure understood what had happened. Montgomery had been sidelined, neutered, reduced from a strategic partner to a tactical executor, and Montgomery knew it. His letters to Brooke throughout February and March are painful to read. Complaints about being ignored. Frustration at watching Americans make what he considered strategic mistakes without being able to intervene. But always underneath the complaints, a recognition that he had brought this on himself. But there is a darker question lurking beneath all of this. Did Montgomery, consciously or unconsciously, sabotage operations after his humiliation? In September 1944, just weeks after the first major confrontation with Eisenhower over command structure, Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden, the plan to capture bridges in the Netherlands and create a corridor into Germany. It was the largest airborne operation in history, and it was a disaster. Most historians attribute the failure to bad intelligence, poor planning, and overconfidence. But there is a minority view, championed by some American historians, that Montgomery pushed for Market Garden knowing it was too risky, that he wanted a spectacular victory to prove his strategic vision, and when that was not possible, he was willing to accept a spectacular failure to prove that Eisenhower's caution was wrong. Is that fair? Probably not. Market Garden failed for a lot of reasons, and attributing it to deliberate sabotage is almost certainly going too far. But the timing is suspicious. The operation came immediately after Montgomery lost his bid for overall ground command, and the aggressive, almost reckless nature of the plan was completely out of character for Montgomery, who was usually methodical to a fault. What we do know for certain is that Montgomery's influence collapsed after the Versailles meeting. And in the vacuum he left behind, something interesting happened. American and British forces started working together more effectively. Without Montgomery constantly maneuvering for advantage, without the endless political games, the actual soldiers and junior officers found ways to cooperate that had been impossible before. Bradley and Montgomery's replacement liaison officers developed a genuine working relationship. Information flowed more freely. Tactical coordination improved. It was as if removing the source of friction at the top allowed everything below to function smoothly. There is a lesson in that. Sometimes the problem is not the system. Sometimes the problem is one person who cannot see beyond their own ego. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do, not just for the organization but for that person, is to remove them from a position they are no longer capable of handling. But Montgomery never forgave Eisenhower. Not really. In his post-war memoirs, published in 1958, Montgomery is careful, diplomatic. He praises Eisenhower's political skills, acknowledges his role in holding the alliance together. But if you read between the lines, the bitterness is still there. The conviction that he, Montgomery, understood how to win the war and that Eisenhower's approach was wasteful and inefficient. And yet, there is one moment that suggests something deeper, something closer to reconciliation. In 1969, Eisenhower died. Montgomery was in his 80s by then, retired, largely forgotten by a world that had moved on from World War II. But when he heard about Eisenhower's death, Montgomery wrote a private letter to Eisenhower's widow, Mamie. That letter was never published, never released to the press. But a copy exists in the Eisenhower Presidential Library, and in it, Montgomery writes something unexpected. He calls Eisenhower a difficult friend, but a great man. He says that history will judge Eisenhower more kindly than his contemporaries did. And then, in a line that still surprises historians, he writes, "I wish I had been more worthy of his patience." That is as close as Montgomery ever came to admitting he was wrong. If you want to understand why this story matters today, why it is more than just a historical curiosity about two stubborn men arguing 80 years ago, you need to look at what happened after the documents started coming out. 1974, the first major release. Bradley's personal papers become public 30 years after his death as specified in his will. Historians suddenly have access to his unfiltered thoughts about Montgomery. The memorandums, the resignation threats, the private fury that had been carefully hidden during the war. The narrative shifts. Montgomery is no longer just the eccentric British general. He becomes the villain who nearly destroyed Allied unity. 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. KGB archives open, at least partially, and researchers discover the Gustav files. Suddenly, this is not just a story about ego and command structure. It is a story about espionage, about how Soviet intelligence exploited Western division, about how close Stalin came to dominating post-war Europe because two Allied commanders could not get along. The stakes retroactively increase. What seemed like a petty dispute now looks like a geopolitical crisis. 1995. The Churchill-Roosevelt telegrams get declassified on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, and there it is, in black and white. Churchill telling Roosevelt that Montgomery is more trouble than he is worth. Churchill giving Eisenhower permission to do whatever was necessary. The British establishment is furious. Montgomery's defenders claim the telegrams are out of context, that Churchill was just managing Roosevelt's ego. But the words are clear, unambiguous. Churchill had thrown Montgomery to the wolves. 2001. Montgomery's private letters to Alan Brooke finally see daylight. His raw, unfiltered account of the Versailles meeting. The humiliation, the anger, the slow, painful acceptance that he had lost. Historians read these letters, and something unexpected happens. Sympathy. Not agreement, but sympathy. Because the letters reveal a man who genuinely believed he was right, who genuinely thought he was trying to save lives, who could not understand why his brilliance was not enough to overcome political reality. 2003. The final major release from Eisenhower's personal papers, including that telegram from Marshall giving him authority to fire Montgomery, including the notes from his rehearsals with Bedell Smith, including, most importantly, a private letter Eisenhower wrote to his brother in 1952 7 years after the war, where he admits, "I have often wondered if I was too hard on Monty. He was difficult, but he was also brilliant. Perhaps I could have handled it better." That letter changes everything, because it shows that Eisenhower, the victor in this confrontation, the man who broke Montgomery's influence, carried his own doubts, his own regrets. It humanizes both men in a way that the official histories never could. But here is what none of these releases have included: the actual notes from the Versailles meeting, the documents Eisenhower burned in that fireplace. We know they existed. Multiple sources reference them, but they are gone, destroyed, lost to history. Or are they? There is a rumor that has persisted in intelligence circles for decades. A rumor that the Office of Strategic Services, against all protocols, against all orders, recorded that meeting. That somewhere in a classified archive, there exists an audio recording of Eisenhower and Montgomery's confrontation. The actual voices, the actual words, everything. The rumor is impossible to verify. The CIA, which inherited OSS records, has never confirmed or denied the existence of such a recording. Freedom of Information Act requests have been filed and rejected on national security grounds, but the rumor will not die. And if the recording exists, if it is real, it is currently classified until 2045, 100 years after the event, standard protocol for the most sensitive intelligence materials. Which means that 20 years from now, if we are all still around, if the world has not ended, we might finally hear what really happened in that room. We might finally know exactly what Eisenhower said and exactly how Montgomery responded. The last mystery of World War II might finally be solved. But until then, we have to work with what we know, with the fragments that survived, with the testimony of those who were there, with the documents that escaped destruction. And what those fragments tell us is this: leadership in coalition warfare is impossibly difficult. You are managing not just military strategy, but national pride, political pressure, personal ego, and historical legacy all at once. One wrong move, and the whole thing collapses. Eisenhower understood this better than almost anyone. He spent years absorbing criticism, deflecting blame, mediating disputes. He made himself the target so that others could work together. But even he had a breaking point. Even he reached a moment where patience became weakness and diplomacy became enabling. The lesson is not that confrontation is always the answer. The lesson is that knowing when to confront, knowing when to draw the line, is what separates good leaders from great ones. Montgomery never learned that lesson. His brilliance was real. His tactical skill was undeniable, but he could not see beyond his own certainty. He could not accept that being right about strategy does not give you the right to undermine your commander. And that blindness cost him everything. Today, the same dynamics play out in NATO headquarters, in corporate boardrooms, in political coalitions around the world. Different names, different circumstances, but the same fundamental tension between cooperation and ego, between unity and ambition. And occasionally, someone has to do what Eisenhower did: stand up, draw the line, and say, in whatever words fit the moment, this is how it is going to be. Accept it or leave. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. And the confrontation in Versailles, that moment when Eisenhower stopped being diplomatic and started being definitive, is a rhythm we should all recognize. Because sooner or later, we all face our Montgomery, that person who cannot accept that they are not in charge, that person whose ego threatens to destroy what everyone else is trying to build. And when that moment comes, the question is simple: do you have the courage to do what Eisenhower did? If this story gave you something to think about, if it showed you a side of World War II you never knew existed, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Not because I need the numbers, though I will not pretend they do not matter, but because next week I am bringing you another story that will absolutely blow your mind, and I think you will want to be there for it. Turn on notifications if you are into that sort of thing, or do not. I am not your boss, but I will be here either way, digging up the stories that history tried to bury. See you next time.